In the summer of 1988, Denton County, Texas recorded its driest consecutive stretch since the Dust Bowl years, 63 days without measurable rainfall, temperatures that held above 100 degrees from June clear through to the middle of August, and a wheat loss that took nearly 40% of the small farms in the county down to bare ruin. The county extension office handed out pamphlets about drought-resistant crops that nobody read. The banks sent letters that everyone read too carefully. Families who had worked the same land for 3 and 4 generations sat around kitchen tables in the evenings and stared at numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times you ran them. Some of those families left. Some of them sold. And a small few of them stayed and watched their neighbors go and told themselves, quietly, in the particular way that stubborn people do, that they would find another way. Harlan Deese was 71 years old that summer and he didn't own much of anything that mattered on paper. His farm, 112 acres on the east side of the county road that ran between the towns of Millbrook and Cale, had a mortgage that went back to 1974, a barn that listed slightly to the south after a windstorm had knocked out 2 of its corner posts in 1981, and a 1963 Oliver tractor that he had rebuilt 3 times with his own hands, and a set of manuals he kept wrapped in a piece of oilcloth in the tool shed. His wife, Dora, had died in the spring of 1985. He had continued farming without her the way a man continues breathing after something inside him breaks, not because it felt good, but because stopping was not something the body knew how to do. He had one son, Marcus, who lived in Fort Worth and worked for a company that made something to do with computers. Marcus called on Sundays and asked his father to sell and move closer to the city. Harlan always said he'd think about it. He never did. What Harlan did do, that summer of 1988, was something that made the other farmers in the county shake their heads and look away the way people do when they don't want to watch something embarrassing. While everyone else was hauling off what remained of their dead crops and trying to salvage equipment, Harlan Deese began collecting trash. Not garbage exactly, but the kind of material that farms accumulate over decades and eventually abandon at the edges of fields and behind sheds. Old wooden pallets. Rusted tin sheeting. Cracked clay pots. A pile of broken concrete blocks that had been sitting behind his barn since before Dora was alive. Lengths of aluminum irrigation pipe so old and dented they'd been replaced with new PVC 3 seasons before. He collected it all into one long area on the north end of his property, a quarter-acre stretch that had never grown much of anything because the soil there was poor and rocky and slightly elevated, which meant that in wet years the water ran off it and in dry years the wind came across it hard and the topsoil blew away in reddish sheets. His neighbor, Bill Carver, drove by one afternoon in his pickup and stopped at the fence. Bill was 64 and had 400 acres and a son-in-law who helped work it. He was the kind of man who measured other people's intelligence by the size of their operation. "Harlan," he called out. "What in the world are you doing up there?" Harlan was on his knees arranging broken concrete blocks into rows. He looked up slowly, the way old men do when their knees have made a decision before their brain has. "Building something," he said. "Building what?" "Not sure yet. Building the ground first." Bill watched him for a moment. "You know they're saying this drought could go another 6 weeks." "I know. You got anything left in that south field?" "Little bit." Bill shook his head. "That north patch you're messing with, that ground's no good." "Never has been. My daddy used to say your daddy tried to work it 40 years ago and gave up." "That's true," Harlan said. He went back to placing his blocks. Bill sat there another minute, then drove on. That evening at the Millbrook Co-op, where the farmers gathered most days around 4 o'clock to talk about rain and prices in the news, Bill mentioned that old Harlan Deese had finally gone around the bend. "Man's up there stacking trash on the worst patch of ground in the county," he said, and a few of the men laughed, not cruelly, but the way people laugh when they are themselves frightened and it helps to look at someone else. What none of them knew, what Harlan had never spoken about to anyone except Dora, and before her to his own father, was that he had been thinking about that quarter acre for most of his life. He had read about it quietly, in the way that self-taught people read, which is to say obsessively and without any formal structure. He had a shelf of books in the farmhouse that Marcus, on his last visit, had called a fire hazard and a mystery. There were books on soil science from the 1940s and 1950s with handwritten notes in the margins. There were pamphlets from the Rodale Institute about organic matter. There were old issues of a magazine called The Land that Harlan had been subscribing to since 1961. There were 2 books about something called Hugelkultur, a German word for a method of mound gardening using buried wood and organic debris to create soil that retained moisture and generated its own warmth, that he had mail-ordered in 1979 and read until the spines gave out. He had been waiting, in the patient way that farmers wait, for the right time. And a drought year, he had reasoned, was exactly the right time. Because if you could prove that a method worked in a drought, then you had proved it in the hardest possible conditions. And if you failed, well, in a drought year everything failed, and nobody would notice one more failure on a patch of ground that had never grown anything to speak of anyway. He began in July. By August, he had built 3 long mounds, each one about 4 feet high and 12 feet wide and roughly 30 feet long, running east to west to catch the morning sun along their southern faces. The cores of the mounds were made from the rotted wood he'd gathered: old fence posts, broken pallet wood, a section of an elm tree that had died along the creek bed buried deep, where they would absorb moisture and release it slowly, like sponges inside the earth. Over the wood he laid the broken concrete, which would hold warmth. Over that he spread old straw, cardboard from feed store boxes, coffee grounds he'd collected in 5-gallon buckets from the diner in Millbrook where he ate breakfast on Wednesdays and Fridays, and then a thick layer of compost he had been building in a bin behind the toolshed for 6 years. On top of all of that went a thin layer of the best topsoil he could scrape from the bottom of a low spot near the creek, where organic matter had settled over decades into something dark and dense and alive. He watered the mounds by hand each evening with a 5-gallon bucket, walking back and forth from the stock tank, which still held water because he'd kept it clean. The heat that August was something that pressed down on a person like a physical weight. The sky turned white by 10 in the morning and stayed white until the sun dropped below the mesquite line in the evenings, and the ground cracked in wide zigzag patterns across the fields that looked like something had shattered underneath the earth. Harlan worked in the early mornings and the late evenings and sat in the shade of the barn through the worst of the midday hours, drinking iced tea from a mason jar and reading, or sometimes just sitting with his hands on his knees and looking out at what he was building. He missed Dora most in those quiet afternoon hours. She had been the one who understood what he was doing before he ever explained it. She had the kind of mind that could see the shape of an idea before it had been turned into words. She would have sat beside him on the old bench outside the barn door and said something like, "You're going to prove Bill Carver wrong, aren't you?" And he would have said, "I'm not doing it to prove anybody wrong," and she would have smiled and said, "I know. That's why it's going to work." He planted in September, when the temperatures finally broke and a front came through that dropped 3/4 of an inch of rain across the county in a single evening. He planted garlic along the south face of the mounds, where the drainage would keep the roots from rotting. He planted winter squash along the tops, where the vines could spread downhill. He planted turnips and kale and a variety of dry bean called turkey craw that he had grown every year since 1966, saved from seed every season, and kept in small paper envelopes in a coffee tin on the pantry shelf. The turkey craw bean was his particular seed. His mother had given it to him. Her mother had grown it before her. The seed had been on this land longer than any mortgage. Through October he watched. The mounds did not look like much from the road. They were just 3 long raised shapes on a scrubby piece of north end ground, and when the wind came up and blew the dry grass sideways, they looked like nothing more than badly stacked debris. Which, in the accounting of some people, was exactly what they were. Harlan went to the co-op less that fall. He did not want to explain what he was doing because he knew that explaining it would change it, that words would flatten it into something that sounded either too simple or too complicated, and either way people would find reasons why it wouldn't work. He had been around long enough to know that the surest way to stop a person from trying something was to describe it to someone who hadn't tried it yet. He did go in one Wednesday in late October, and Bill Carver was there with 3 other men, and they were talking about the winter wheat outlook and the price of fuel. Bill looked up when Harlan came in and said, "Still playing in your compost pile, Harlan?" The other men glanced at each other. Harlan poured his coffee from the pot on the counter and said, something like that. "I'll say this," said a younger man named Todd Pearson, who had 200 acres and a brother-in-law in the agricultural lending business. "I've driven by and I can't figure out what you're building. Looks like you dug up half your north end." "Did," Harlan said. "What for?" Harlan stirred his coffee. "Trying something." "You know that ground's been exhausted since before we were born," Todd said. "Even with amendments, You'd need years to get any real tilth back in it.
Probably, Harlan agreed.
Todd looked at Bill. They had the particular kind of exchange that people have with their eyes when they've confirmed something they already believed. Harlan drank his coffee and talked about the weather and the price of diesel and drove home. That night he walked the mounds in the dark. The garlic was up, small green spears, just barely visible in the moonlight. The squash vines had run 4 feet down the sides of the mounds and were still putting on leaves this late in the season, later than anything in the flat fields around them. He knelt and pressed his hand into the soil at the base of one mound and felt what he had been hoping to feel: warmth.
The buried wood was decomposing.
The compost was working. The mound was generating its own slow heat the way a living thing does, and in a county that had suffered one of the worst droughts in half a century, the soil under his hands felt damp.
Not wet. Just alive.
He stayed there a long time in the dark, not praying exactly, but something close to it. He thought about his father, who had tried to work this same patch and given up. He thought about what his father hadn't known, not because his father was a stupid man, but because some knowledge takes generations to accumulate, and the generation that accumulates it doesn't always get to use it. He thought about Dora saying once, when they were young and struggling and the bank had called about the second mortgage and she had sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded on top of an envelope she hadn't opened yet, she had said, "The ones who last are the ones who learn the ground, Harlan. Money comes and goes, but what you know about this particular place, that's yours."
November came in cold and clear. The garlic thickened.
The squash set fruit so late in the season that Harlan had to cover the vines on the nights when frost threatened, walking out in the dark with he wrote the number in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket.
December brought a killing frost that took everything left in the flat fields.
But the mounds, elevated and dense with organic material and warming from within, held on 2 weeks longer. He harvested the last of the squash on the 18th of December, big blue-green hubbards that had cured on the vine and would keep through February in the cellar.
He counted 14 of them. He wrote that number down too.
Then the ground went quiet for winter. Harlan spent January the way he spent most winters, slowly, deliberately, without rushing.
He read.
He repaired the Oliver tractor, replacing a cracked fitting on the hydraulic line that he'd been nursing along since October. He drove to the feed store in Millbrook and to the library in the county seat, which had a small agricultural section and a librarian named Mrs. Aldine Pratt who had, over the years, learned to order books for him without being asked, because she had figured out the pattern of his interests and found it interesting herself. It was Mrs. Pratt who handed him, in January of 1989, a stack of materials about a topic he'd read around the edges of for years: the restoration of degraded soil through intentional fungal networks, the science of mycorrhizae and their relationship to plant root systems, the work being done at university extension programs in Oregon and New England about what was then called biological farming. He took the stack home and read it cover to cover over 2 weeks, making notes in his breast pocket notebook, cross-referencing what he read with what his hands had already learned. He expanded the mounds in February, when the ground softened enough to work. He added a fourth mound, shorter than the others, running north-south this time, which he planned to use for an experiment with alliums. He built a small cold frame from salvaged storm windows at the south end of the mound system and started seedlings inside it in early March: tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, herbs, varieties he'd been collecting seed from for 30 years and keeping in labeled envelopes in the coffee tin alongside the turkey craw beans. Spring of 1989 was a different season from the year before. A wet April. 3 good rains in May, spaced out the way farmers pray for rain to come slowly, with time between each one for the ground to absorb it rather than shed it. In the flat fields around Harlan's north end, the moisture was welcome but the ground was tired. 3 decades of tilling and chemical fertilizer and monocrop planting had left it with poor structure, the kind of soil that crusts over between rains and doesn't hold moisture well and grows things only when you push it hard. Bill Carver put in his corn. Todd Pearson put in his wheat and grain sorghum.
Everyone watched the sky and calculated.
On Harlan's mounds, something different was happening. He had inoculated the soil in the fall with a powder, spores of mycorrhizal fungi that he had ordered from a small company in Vermont, which his son Marcus had looked up for him using something called the internet, and which had arrived in a small foil-sealed package with instructions written on paper thin enough to read through. He had mixed the powder into his compost before the final application and worked it gently into the top layer of each mound. By spring, if it had established, and he wouldn't know until he saw the results in the roots of whatever grew, it would mean that every plant on those mounds would have access to a web of fungal threads extending far beyond its own root system, drawing water and minerals from a radius many times larger than the plant could reach alone. By June, the mounds were astonishing. That was the only word for it, and it was the word that Bill Carver used, involuntarily, when he stopped his truck at the fence one morning and looked at what was growing on Harlan's north end. The tomato plants were 4 feet tall and covered in fruit in various stages of ripening, so heavy with tomatoes that Harlan had staked each one with lengths of rebar he'd bent by hand in the barn. The squash vines ran 10 and 12 feet from the crown of the mounds, enormous leaves sheltering the ground beneath them and keeping the moisture in. The bean plants were thick-stemmed and dark green, nodding with pods. The kale had overwintered in the mounds and grown into something closer to small trees than garden plants, ribbed blue-green leaves as wide as dinner plates. "Lord have mercy," Bill said. Harlan was picking tomatoes into a bushel basket at the time. He straightened up slowly. "Warning, Bill. What did you do to that ground?" "Fed it." "How?" "Wood. Compost. Thyme. Fungi." Harlan said it the same way he'd have said a list of tools. "Just things. Just methods." "Fungi," Bill repeated. "Mycorrhizal. They make a kind of network in the soil that helps the plant roots reach further. Like putting in extra root systems for free." Bill stared at the mounds. His corn was doing fine this year. It was a good year, wet enough, warm enough. But the difference between fine and what he was looking at through Harlan's fence was not a small thing. What he was looking at was the kind of growing you saw in photographs in seed catalogs that you assumed were edited. "How much you put into this?" Bill asked. "Money? Not much. Bought the fungal spores. Cost $32. Bill looked at him a long time. "That's it?" "Most of what's in those mounds was trash," Harlan said. "Your daddy's trash, probably." "Mine. Wood that was already rotted. Concrete that was already broken. Cardboard. Coffee grounds. The seed I've been saving since before you and I were neighbors." Bill got out of his truck and came to the fence and looked more carefully. He was not a man who was comfortable being impressed, but he was also not, at the core of him, a dishonest man. "The soil on those mounds," he said. "What does it feel like?" "Come through the gate," Harlan said. Bill unlatched the gate and walked up to the nearest mound and crouched down and pushed his fingers into the soil at the base of a tomato plant. He pulled his hand back and looked at his fingers. The soil was dark and loose and it clung slightly to his skin the way good soil does, not sticky, but alive. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. "It's like potting soil," he said. "Better," Harlan said quietly. "Potting soil's dead. This is alive." Bill stood up. He looked at the fields around him, the flat, cracking, hard-working ground of Denton County, Texas, and he looked at Harlan's mounds, and something moved across his face that was more complicated than just surprise. It was the expression of a man confronting the distance between what he had assumed and what was true. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Bill asked. "Would you have listened?" Bill started to say something and then stopped. He looked down at his boots. "No," he said. "Probably not." Harlan nodded. He went back to picking tomatoes. That summer, word got around the way things do in small counties, not by announcement but by the particular process of enough people driving slowly past the same fence line and stopping and looking and then driving away and talking about what they'd seen. Todd Pearson stopped one afternoon. Two brothers named Garza, who farmed 160 acres 2 miles to the south and who had been quietly struggling with depleted ground since their father died and left them a farm that had been cropped without rotation for 15 years, came and stood at the fence together and asked Harlan questions for 45 minutes. He answered every one of them without impatience. He was not, he made clear, selling anything or preaching anything. He was just doing what he had done, trying something on bad ground, and showing what he'd found. That was all. The county extension agent, a young man named Dale Renfro who had a master's degree in agronomy from Texas A&M and who had come to Denton County in 1987 and spent most of his time trying to get farmers to adopt practices they'd been ignoring for decades, heard about Harlan's North End in July and drove out on a Tuesday morning in a white state truck. Harlan gave him the same tour he'd given Bill Carver, and answered the same questions, and showed Dale the notebook with his observations going back to the previous summer, soil temperature readings, moisture levels recorded by pushing his finger into the ground and noting what he felt, yield weights, seed counts. Dale Renfro stood at the edge of the mound and looked at the notebook and was very quiet for a while. "Mr. Deese," he said finally, "how long have you been thinking about this approach?" "Most of my life," Harlan said. "And you said you got some of this from books?" "What books?" "I'll write them down for you," Harlan said. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook and wrote down the titles of everything he'd read that had been relevant. It took a moment because there were quite a few of them. He tore the page out carefully along the edge and handed it to Dale. Dale looked at the list. There were books on it that he recognized and books that were new to him, and seeing both on the same handwritten list from a 72-year-old farmer with arthritic hands and an 8th grade education made him feel something that took him a few minutes to identify, and that he identified eventually as humility. "Would you be willing to let us document this?" Dale asked. "As a case study. For the extension program." Harlan considered it. "You can document it," he said. "But I want one thing." "What's that?" "The Garza brothers. Help them set up something similar. Don't charge them. Their land needs it more than mine did." Dale looked at him. "I can do that," he said. "And the bean seed," Harlan said. He went to the shed and came back with a small paper bag. "Turkey craw. I've been saving this since 1966. Before that it was my mother's. Before that it was her mother's. I don't know how far back it goes." He handed the bag to Dale. "I want this in a seed library somewhere. Somewhere permanent. In case something happens to my tin." Dale took the bag carefully, the way you take something when you understand you are being trusted with it. "Yes, sir," he said. August came, and with it the harvest. Harlan's 4 mounds produced, in their first full season, more food than his flat south field had in any of the previous 5 years combined. He had tomatoes enough to put up 63 quarts in mason jars, which lined the cellar shelves in deep red rows. He had winter squash stacked under the barn stairs. He had dry beans, turkey craw and 2 others he'd grown from saved seed, in cotton sacks that he weighed on the kitchen scale and recorded in his notebook. He had garlic braided and hung from the rafters, enough to last until the following summer's harvest and to replant 3 times over. He had kale and turnips and a late crop of green beans and peppers that he took to the small farmers market that ran on Saturday mornings in the parking lot behind the Millbrook hardware store. He had never sold at the farmers market before. Dora had, once, years ago, when they'd had a particularly good pepper year, but Harlan had always thought of what they grew as food for themselves, not product. But the mounds had changed his sense of what was possible, and so on a Saturday morning in late August he loaded the truck with bushel baskets and a card table and a handwritten sign and drove to the hardware store parking lot. He sold out before 9 in the morning. The woman who ran the market, a retired schoolteacher named Arlette Bone who wore a wide straw hat and kept a logbook of every vendor who'd ever sold there, came to his table at 8:55 and looked at his empty baskets and said, "Where'd you get this produce?" "Grew it," Harlan said. "Where?" "North end of my place." "Bad ground." She looked at him carefully. "That's the old Deese farm. East of the county road." "That's the one." She wrote something in her logbook. "Next week, can you bring twice as much?" "I'll try," he said. He drove home in the old truck through the flat land of Denton County, past Bill Carver's corn and Todd Pearson's grain fields and the Garza brothers' property where, he noticed with satisfaction, someone had been moving debris to the north corner, old wood, broken materials, the beginning of something. He drove slow the way he always did on these back roads, partly because the truck's transmission preferred it, and partly because he liked to look at the land. He thought about his father, who had tried this ground and failed. He thought about his mother, who had given him the first envelope of turkey cross seed with her thin hands, holding it like it was something precious because it was. He thought about Dora, who would have stood beside him at the farmer's market that morning with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes bright, not saying much, just being there. He thought about what she would have said tonight at the supper table. She would have said, "You always knew." And he would have said, "I didn't know. I tried." And she would have said, "That's the same thing." The county extension office put out a report in the fall of 1989 that included a case study of what Dale Renfro had taken to calling, in the careful language of agricultural science, small-scale intensive biological mound cultivation using locally sourced organic matter and mycorrhizal inoculation on previously exhausted marginal land. It was 12 pages long and included photographs and soil test comparisons and yield data and a bibliography of sources, many of which were on the handwritten list Harlan had given Dale that summer morning. Dale sent Harlan a copy in the mail. Harlan read it at the kitchen table with his glasses on, sitting in the same chair where he had read Dora's medical reports in 1984, and the first mortgage notice in 1974, and his draft notice in 1951. He read it carefully, and when he was done he set it face down on the table and sat for a while. The phone rang. It was Marcus, calling on Sunday as he always did. "Dad," Marcus said, "someone in my office showed me something today. There's a county agricultural report out of Denton County with your name in it. With pictures of your farm." "I know," Harlan said. "Dad." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing out there? Would you have understood?" A pause. "Probably not," Marcus admitted. "But I would have liked to hear it from you." "I'm telling you now," Harlan said. "You want to hear it?" "Yes," Marcus said. "I want to hear all of it." So Harlan told him. He started from the beginning, from the summer of 1988 when the drought came and the other farmers hauled their dead crops away, and he started collecting what looked like trash on the worst patch of ground he owned. He told him about the buried wood and the broken concrete and the compost he'd been building for 6 years. He told him about the German word, hugelkultur, and the books he'd ordered in 1979, and the fungal spores from Vermont, and the turkey craw bean seed that went back further than anyone still living could remember. He talked for a long time, and Marcus listened the way he hadn't listened in years, not like a son managing a father, but like a person hearing something that surprised him with how much it mattered. When Harlan finished, Marcus said, "I didn't know you knew all that." "Nobody asked," Harlan said gently. "I'm asking now. What else do you know?" And Harlan smiled the slow, private smile of a man who has been waiting a long time to be asked the right question, and he said, "Son, I've got 3 more shelves of books and 40 years of notes. You got time?" The fall of 1989 was one of the better harvest seasons Denton County had seen in a decade. Bill Carver's corn came in strong. The Garza brothers finished building their first mound and planted it in garlic and winter greens and stood back and looked at it with the particular expression of people who have begun something they don't fully understand yet but feel certain about. Harlan came out of the tool shed and watched him come. "I owe you an apology," Todd said. "You don't owe me anything," Harlan said. "I said your ground was exhausted. I said it would take years." "It did take years," Harlan said. "Just not the way you meant." Todd crouched by the nearest mound and looked at the soil. The squash vines had died back with the frost, but the garlic was up again, second year in the same beds, and the kale had gone through a light freeze and come back sweeter, the way kale does when the cold gets into it. "What do I need to start?" Todd asked. "Wood," Harlan said. "Old wood is best. And something to compost. And time. Mostly time. And the fungi?" "I'll order you a packet," Harlan said. $32. But the truth is, if you build the mound right, they'll find their way eventually on their own. They're already in the ground. They're in every piece of land that's ever had a tree on it. You just have to give them something to work with. Todd stood up and looked across the mounds and out at the surrounding flat fields, his own and Bill's and the county road and the mesquite line on the horizon. It was October, late afternoon, and the light was coming across low and golden the way it does in that part of Texas in the fall, turning everything warm and specific. "You going to expand it next year?" he asked. A little, Harlan said.
Going to run 2 more mounds east along the creekside. Try some fruit trees, pawpaws, maybe. Some elderberry. Things that'll be there after I'm gone. After I'm gone.
Todd looked at him. Harlan was saying it plainly, the way farmers speak about things, without sentiment but without avoidance either.
He was 72 years old.
He was thin and moved slowly and his hands shook slightly when he held them still. But he was standing in his field in the October light with the expression of a man who had unfinished work ahead of him and intended to get to it.
You planning on going somewhere soon? Todd said.
Not if I can help it, Harlan said. In the spring of 1990, Marcus drove down from Fort Worth on a Friday afternoon and arrived at the farm before supper. He stood in the driveway looking at the north end for a long time, at the mounds that were greening up again with their second-year plantings, at the cold frame with its seedling trays, at the tool shed with the door open and the Oliver tractor visible inside, gleaming from the fresh oil Harlan had put on it last week.
You need help? Marcus asked.
Always, Harlan said.
I mean, I could come down more. On weekends. I've been thinking about it.
Marcus looked at his father.
I've been thinking about a lot of things.
Harlan looked at his son, the city clothes, the careful haircut, the hands that hadn't done field work in 20 years. And he looked at his son's eyes, which had in them something he hadn't seen since Marcus was a boy walking the rows beside him, asking questions that Harlan had tried to answer as fully as he could, knowing even then that the answers would matter more later than they did at the time. Come inside, Harlan said. Supper's almost ready.
After we eat I'll show you the seed tin. They went inside.
The kitchen smelled like the soup Harlan had on the stove, a white bean and kale soup made from things he'd grown and put up himself, and the house was warm and the shelves were full of books and the cellar was full of jars. Marcus sat at the kitchen table in the chair that had been his since he was 8 years old, and Harlan brought the soup to the table and sat across from him, and they ate.
After supper Harlan went to the pantry and came back with the coffee tin.
He set it on the table between them and took the lid off. Inside were the envelopes, dozens of them, each one labeled in Harlan's handwriting, each one holding seeds that had been grown on this land or brought to this land by people who were gone now.
Turkey craw bean. Mortgage lifter tomato. Jimmy Nardello pepper. Bloody butcher corn. Cherokee purple. Tennessee red Valencia. Names that were also histories. Names that were also arguments against forgetting.
Marcus picked up one envelope and read the label. Then another. He turned them in his hands the way you handle things you realize you've been taking for granted.
How many varieties? He asked.
46, Harlan said.
Some of them I haven't been able to grow out in a few years.
They'll need planting soon or the viability will drop.
Marcus set the envelopes down carefully.
He looked at his father across the kitchen table, in the house where he had grown up, on the land that had been in their family since his grandfather broke it. Tell me which ones need planting first, he said. Outside, the night was clear and cold and the stars over Denton County were bright the way they are when the air is dry and there are no clouds and you are far enough from the city lights to see what the sky actually holds. The mounds on the north end sat dark and waiting in the field, alive inside with the slow work of wood becoming soil, of fungi threading through the dark making connections that nothing above the surface could see but that everything above the surface depended on. The Oliver tractor sat in the shed with its rebuilt engine and its oilcloth manuals and its 40 years of patient use. The mason jars lined the cellar shelves. The seed envelopes lay spread on the kitchen table between a father and his son, and the conversation between them had found, after years of near misses, its right language at last. It was not a story about getting rich. Harlan Deese did not get rich. The farm did not become famous. No magazine came to photograph it, no television crew, no celebrity chef searching for heirloom vegetables. What happened was quieter and more durable than any of that. The mounds kept growing. The Garza brothers built 3 more of their own and sent a letter to the extension office saying their soil test results had changed dramatically in 2 years. Dale Renfro started including Harlan's methods in his extension presentations, attributing them always by name, the way knowledge deserves to be attributed. The turkey craw bean seed made it into the Denton County Seed Library and then, through Dale's connections at the university, into a regional seed bank in Austin where it was cataloged with a note about its provenance and age.
Bill Carver never built a mound.
But he did stop calling Harlan's north end a compost pile. And one spring morning he came through the gate without asking and worked beside Harlan for 4 hours without being invited, staking tomato plants and asking questions in his gruff, slightly embarrassed way, and Harlan answered every one of them without saying "I told you so," because that was not the kind of man he was, and also because the tomatoes needed staking and there was no time for it.
The land that everyone had written off.
The ground that a father had tried and abandoned, that a neighbor had dismissed for decades, that a county full of struggling farmers had passed every day without imagining it could be otherwise. That land, in the hands of a man who read quietly and thought slowly and worked without needing to be watched, had become something.
Not something dramatic. Not something that solved everything. But something real, and lasting, and alive.
There is a kind of knowledge that does not announce itself. It accumulates in notebooks kept in breast pockets and on shelves that look like fire hazards. It waits in coffee tins in pantries and in seed envelopes labeled in handwriting that shakes only when the hands are still. It lives in the long patience of people who have learned that the land does not reward hurry, does not reward noise, does not reward the confidence of those who have not earned it. What everyone thought was trash, the broken wood and the cracked concrete and the rotted fence posts and the 40-year-old seed in the tin, was never trash at all. It was just waiting for someone who knew what it was.